This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 917 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting to the mailbag questions this week, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Over on Underdog right now, you can play Pick'em, but there's some really cool best ball contests, like their new Best Ball Resurrection Tournament. If you sign up over there with promo code LATEROUND, you'll get a nice deposit offer, a free pick that'll help you win some cash, and then also my rest of season rankings. Those rest of season rankings are updated every Tuesday through the end of the season. You get access to all of those updates. Make sure you take advantage of these offers. Head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. And when you sign up, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from Matthew. It says, with the recent news coming out of McCaffrey's visit to Germany, do you think he will be out for the rest of the season? Or if he has a chance of coming back, would there be any elite tier players you would trade for him? Thanks, JJ. Now, I'm not surprised by it, but a ton of people were asking me this week about Christian McCaffrey. And I've got to say, you guys, there are some questions that I get where I just legitimately have no idea. I have no real answer for it. I don't even think the 49ers know the answer to this question. So for me to sit on this podcast and pretend like I have a clear answer would be stupid. I tell people all the time that I like to make moves, I like to trade when it's related to something that I can actually control. I can't control Christian McCaffrey's situation, but I can control how I evaluate talent. Like I saw one breakdown where they said that he might be back week 8, but there's a better chance that he was back week 12. Now, this isn't a diss to the person who said that. It's that there's so little information about what's going on. Not just because of the media and the 49ers and how they're handling it, but because it's clearly not an injury that's got some set timeline to it. I don't know. Whether you go for Christian McCaffrey depends entirely on your own risk tolerance. Period. That's it. I will say, though, that I don't think this Germany stuff is necessarily a bad thing. It sounds like he's trying to get treatment that he can't get in the United States because he wants to speed up the recovery process. That's not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if you thought that he would be back in like week 6. So anything CMC related, I honestly can't really help you with it. I know as much as you do. All I can say is that if you want a high variance player, one who could sink your team, but also win you a championship, then feel free to target him. If you don't want to invite that kind of variance on your team, which I totally understand, then don't trade for him. I know that's an obvious answer, but that's the true answer. It's honestly how I feel about this situation. I don't want to sit on this podcast or sit on social media or on my Patreon and act like I have answers that I don't have. That's disingenuous. This next question is from @RKDavidson13 on Twitter. It says, is there any data or even hope to think Javonte Williams can turn things around and get back to being a productive fantasy running back? So a lot of people are tilting about Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin to some degree. I was high on McLaughlin in particular entering the season. I know a lot of you are ready for my perspective on the situation, especially the haters. Now this is trending towards an L. But I think there are two pieces of data that we can point to make us feel a little bit better about this situation. First, Denver's offense has been predictably bad. They have 3 offensive touchdowns this season. They're bottom 10 in yards per game. They're bottom 10 in EPA per play. And both Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin have been insanely inefficient. That's especially true of Williams, who basically has only been better than DeAndre Swift this year across the league. Now, I think this was expected to some degree. I've talked a lot about how running backs on teams with rookie quarterbacks usually don't become huge league winners. The reason I was okay with going heavy with Jaleel McLaughlin and why I started to buy into Javonte Williams a week or two before the season started, or at least buy more into him, was because of pass catching. Sean Payton's teams from 2011 to last year had never ranked worse than 6th in running back target share in a single season. Now you can say that that was all personnel based, but they were first last season. Look at the running backs they had last year. You can say it was all Drew Brees being a check down king, but Russell Wilson was a check down king for Sean Payton. And Russell Wilson's teams in Seattle typically ranked in the 20s in running back target share. This is a Sean Payton thing. And not only were those offensive tendencies there for this offense, but Bo Nix seemed like the right quarterback to pair with that. So far this year, Denver ranks below average in running back target share. Their running back target share is almost half of what it was last year. That's a huge, huge problem. That's literally the reason that any of us were bullish on them, whether it was McLaughlin or even Javonte Williams. Now you're probably thinking, where's the hopeful data then, JJ? Well, the hopeful data is that we've only seen 3 games. It started poorly, but rookie quarterbacks tend to get better. And I do think that we're still likely going to see more running back targets moving forward, given what we've seen historically. So it's been bad. It's been no doubt bad. And in most leagues, you're not confidently playing those Denver running backs right now. But that's how you can think about things more optimistically. This next question is from @Zach74556144. It says, what is the ceiling of Bucky Irving rest of season? Now, obviously he's banged up right now. Let's just ignore that for the time being. But look, I brought up Bucky Irving multiple times in this podcast this season already. I've had him as an ad, all of that. But I think people are taking the Bucky Irving takeover a little bit too far. As long as Rachaad White is healthy, I don't see him not having a role on this team, at least as a pass catcher. Receiving has not been Rachaad White's problem in the past. It's been his rushing. He's been an inefficient runner. And Irving's been the opposite of that to start the year. Now, it's not an apples to apples comparison because White is seeing different types of looks. But Irving has been better than White on the ground. Anyone can see that. So I could see a scenario where Irving maybe has like a 65-35 advantage on the ground this season versus Rachaad White. Even last week, we saw him with a running back rush share above 50%. The problem is pass catching. I think that component is capped for Bucky Irving. Because White's being used that way right now, he's being used that way because he's pretty reliable as a pass catcher. Now, Irving's not that bad either. But this is not a situation like, let's say, Zach Moss, where Moss has been the pass catching back for Cincinnati because of pass protection, because he's just a little bit more reliable. But he's not special as a pass catcher, or at least well above average. Rachaad White is actually a plus in the receiving game. So I think for Bucky Irving to be truly unleashed, he probably does need a Rachaad White injury. With that being said, it's nice to have a player who can have that flex value, maybe even be your RB2 for a particular build. It's nice having that guy when you know he also has contingent upside. This next question is from Patreon. It's from CJE Walters. It says, what should we expect out of Xavier Worthy in the Kansas City offense? Is he strictly a touchdown-dependent play week to week? So I got a couple of Worthy questions this week. Let's talk about them. If you listen to the 10 Trends episode this week, you heard me talk about this Chiefs offense a bit. Patrick Mahomes is not throwing it deep. He's taking what defenses are giving him. And that's resulted in the Rashee Rice show. Like among all relevant quarterbacks this year, there have been 31 who have played 100 or more snaps. Among those 31, Patrick Mahomes ranks 30th in average depth of target. Baker Mayfield is last. He's the only one who's lower. Now, with that being said, Mahomes' ADOT is actually a good bit lower than it was last year. So what we've seen to this point, well, I do think it's going to continue, like the idea is going to continue, we should expect some more down the field shots. That's just based on regression and what we even saw last season. But that's been a problem for Worthy so far. According to Sports Info Solutions, 3 of Worthy's 11 targets have come 15 or more yards down the field. 15 plus air yard targets. So they're relatively deep looks. That's a rate of over 27%. Rashee Rice, meanwhile, he's only seen 2 targets that have gone 15 plus air yards. His rate of seeing those targets is 6.8%. Meanwhile, Rice is seeing all the underneath stuff. On targets that travel 5 or fewer air yards, Worthy has 6 of those. That's about 55% of his targets. Rashee Rice has seen 22 targets that have traveled 5 or fewer air yards. That's a 76% rate. The problem is that Worthy and even Travis Kelce to a degree, if you watch this Chiefs offense, they're essentially opening things up for Rashee Rice in this low ADOT offense. It's not that Rice is bad. They're getting him the ball because he's really good after the catch. But this is how this offense is operating. And considering the Chiefs haven't been lighting it up offensively, I don't know if defenses are going to play them much differently. Now, I do expect Mahomes' ADOT, like I said earlier, to regress a little bit, to rise a little bit. And that's naturally going to allow Worthy to make some more explosive plays. So things will get better. I just, at this moment, don't think that we're going to see the Chiefs throwing it all over the field like they did with Tyreek Hill. That means that Worthy, given his current usage, is more boom bust than we'd probably want. But at least we know there's boom potential. He's seen a decent percentage of his targets down the field. And considering his target share, his air yard share is pretty strong. I also think they're naturally just going to give him more manufactured touches as the season goes on. Remember, he's a rookie. He's played 3 NFL games. So I really don't think that we're going to see a wide receiver 2 season this year from Xavier Worthy. But he's good enough to potentially be a volatile wide receiver 3. This next question from Patreon is from DJ Reese 0416. It says, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the buying low strategy. For example, many suggested targeting Jamar Chase after his rough first 2 weeks, especially with a good matchup against Washington ahead. But would any savvy manager actually sell him at a steep discount? It feels like buying low often means taking advantage of less informed managers. Can this strategy ever truly benefit both parties? So I had a conversation about this with Pat Mayo on last week's Late Round Perspectives episode. But yeah, like the idea of buying and selling, it's completely subjective. It's why I have to provide so much context to my buy and sell transactions each week on the 15 Transaction Show. I also, though, can't just not talk about something just because I'm making assumptions about the fantasy football public. It's quite literally impossible to just capture everyone's sentiment on a player. So I try to mix in some buy transactions like that one, like buying Jamar Chase, while also mixing in some that people wouldn't be thinking about as much, like buying Romeo Doubs. Like on the show earlier this week, I could have easily said to buy Jaden Reed because Reed is an awesome player and he's getting Jordan Love back. But instead of focusing on that, I just briefly mentioned it as sort of an aside. I made the focus Romeo Doubs. There are players that I end up being higher and lower on versus Fantasy Pros consensus in my rest of season rankings every single week. Many of them don't make the 15 Transaction Show. I post them on Patreon for patrons, but the players who make 15 transactions, they're the ones who almost kind of have a story behind them. Like, let me give you an example. I do my rest of season rankings after I do my 15 Transaction Show. In order for 15 transactions to be in your inbox for the newsletter or in your podcast feeds on Tuesday morning, I need to work on it on Monday. So my Monday is spent finding the right transactions to post and then writing that column. And that column then turns into a podcast that you guys can listen to. The previous week of games, though, aren't even done yet because we have Monday Night Football. And because of that, there's not much content out there aside from waiver wire columns. Which means even if my rest of season rankings were done, which I start working on those Monday night while I watch the Monday night game, but even if those were done, I'd have nothing to compare them to. I have no idea what the market is really thinking. It's not until Tuesday when I realize who I'm actually higher on or lower on versus the market. And I do that by comparing my rest of season rankings with people who have updated theirs on Fantasy Pros. What that means is that there are players who seem like even more obvious buys after I do the 15 Transaction Show. And there are instances where I say to sell a player, but then I find out I'm actually higher on that player. I like that player more than consensus. This makes the choosing of buy and sell players kind of difficult, if I'm being honest. So what I have to do is just use intuition, use my experience, and I have to come up with buys and sells who have a mathematical story to tell. Like Jamar Chase, you objectively weren't going to have a buy window, even an ounce of a buy window, after he played Washington. So I called that out. Romeo Doubs this week. I just kind of figured that most people would be really focused on Jaden Reed, for good reason. So I thought to myself, hey, what if I focused our attention on the guy who's running the most routes for the Packers right now, who might just be a lower key addition, as opposed to going with the bigger deal to get the more talented wide receiver in Jaden Reed. There's no perfect way of doing this just given the schedule of the NFL and the schedule of fantasy football content. But I can at least tell you guys that I'm trying to mix in transactions that could be helpful for casual leagues and more helpful for competitive ones. But that at least reveals some of the things in my head as I work on that column every Monday. And I'll be the first to admit, I'm rooting for nothing crazy to happen on Monday night, because if that happens, I have to change everything up after I already recorded it. This next question is from @AJK Jules. It says, Jonathon Brooks' value assuming Red Rifle continues to start? This is yet another question that I got a ton this week. And honestly, this kind of plays into what I just talked about with the 15 transactions episode with buying and selling. Brooks was one of those players who I thought would be too obvious of a buy after what we saw from Andy Dalton in week 3. So I didn't feature him on 15 transactions. Part of the thought process there, though, it was like, what am I exactly going to say right now that I haven't already said? Brooks was a very good prospect. He ranked close to Kenneth Walker in the ZAP model. He's not that kind of player. I'm just saying their scores were really close. They're two very different backs. Dave Canales talked up Brooks a good bit after they made that pick, saying that they can use him in the passing game, and considering Canales' usage of Rachaad White last year, that's very, very intriguing. Now, I do think that we're bound to see them slowly ramp Brooks up before he gets a true bell cow workload. But Andy Dalton's performance in week 3 was honestly huge for Brooks. Because not only could Carolina just be more competitive than we thought after week 2, we thought they were done. We thought they were going to be the worst team in like NFL history. But now that offense has some life. And with a better offense comes more opportunities, both in terms of volume and plays run, but also scoring opportunities. So if anyone has Brooks on waivers, or if Brooks is easy to acquire, I would take that chance. He's a relatively low-cost asset with a lot of upside. As I wrote in my draft guide this year, since 2011, we've had 10 rookie running backs get drafted in the RB20 to RB40 range with a prospect score above 93. Of those 10, 4 of them were moderate breakouts. Those are players who exceed ADP expectation by 3 or more PPR points per game. That's a very good hit rate. That's like double of what you'd expect. It's a small sample, but it's at least something. Now, there are definitely some weird circumstances with Brooks given the ACL, but there's also a lot that points to a high ceiling. And I think at the very least, think about the downside case. You get a committee back who would probably be the 1A in that backfield down the stretch. So that downside case, as long as he's playing, it may not be as bad as you think. The last question this week is from @SeabullDan53681. It says, handcuffing your own running backs limits upside on your bench. But where is the line for when this makes sense? Obviously, handcuffing CMC with Mason has saved some seasons. But are others like Charbonnet for Walker worth doing? So through the years, I've gotten legitimate hate mail from people who yell at me because of how I've talked about handcuffing in fantasy football. That's not even hyperbole. It's apparently a very sensitive topic. Handcuffing has really evolved through the years, though. 10 years ago, I did a study on it. We had more clear-cut handcuffs in fantasy football back then, which I define as backup running backs who have zero value unless an injury happens to their starter. Today, we have more split backfields. So there are fewer and fewer of those players. There are backups, but many of those backups can still hold some fantasy value week to week. My stance on even backup running backs, though, has been about upside. I think Christian McCaffrey is a weird example because he entered the season banged up, so you may have approached that differently. But Breece Hall, let's talk about Breece Hall. He's the better example. On teams where I have Breece Hall, I didn't actively draft Braylon Allen. But that doesn't mean that I don't have Braylon Allen across my fantasy leagues. It's that on teams where I don't have Hall, let's say I drafted Bijan Robinson, some of those teams I have Braylon Allen. And people hear that and they're like, man, you're an idiot. What happens if Breece Hall goes down? And everyone, please knock on wood right now. But yeah, I get that. I totally get that. But what happens to my other teams if Breece Hall goes down? What happens to those teams where I have Braylon Allen and not Breece Hall? Now I have powerhouse teams. What people should get from this discussion is that it actually should be team dependent. How you approach handcuffs depends on your team. Now, I approach my drafts that way, but I adjust as the season goes on. If I'm sitting at 3-0 right now, or if I get to week 8 and my team's undefeated, I'll almost definitely go with a more conservative approach, which is handcuffing my own running back. I might even make a trade to secure that handcuff. But if my team is sitting at 0-3 right now, and I lose again this week, then I've got to embrace that upside more. And the upside move is to roster backup running backs where I don't have their starter on my team. It's to get Tyler Algier when I don't have Bijan Robinson because I need upside. And my general argument is that upside does win championships, and that more of you probably need that upside versus protecting your downside. That's why I generally say to handcuff other running backs. But like most things in fantasy football, it's team, it's league, and it's manager dependent. If you're risk averse, just do you. There's no clear-cut right or wrong answer here. It's more so understanding the other side of the argument and just seeing that there's another side to the argument, which in this case, I think there absolutely is. So hopefully that helps you understand what you should do with your individual team. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got a Late Round Perspectives episode dropping later today. Hope you give that a listen. Otherwise, good luck in week 4. I'll talk to you next week.